myth propagated by the official sources is that the decline is everywhere. India is no exception, and India fared its economy much better than others. So that is an argument. The argument is that India fared much better than others. Is this true? Well, I will just quote the International Monetary Fund Global Economic Tracker data. The IMF Global Economic Tracker data reveals that the India is one of the worst affected economies in the G20. Well, I will give you a couple of figures. The worst affected among the G20 is the United Kingdom. Little over 20% decline in GDP. So we are still higher, we are seeing still higher level of contraction than United Kingdom. Our contraction level is 23.9% officially. A country like Brazil, the better comparison will be Brazil. For two reasons, Brazil is a better comparison than the United Kingdom. One, Brazil is also an emerging economy like India, an economy which is of a comparable standards. Two, Brazil is also equally affected nation due to COVID-19. We are number 2 in the total number of cases. Brazil is number 3. And as far as the total number of corona deaths, COVID-19 mortality is concerned, we are number 2. Brazil is number 2. We are number 3. So total number of cases, we are number 2. Brazil number 3. Total number of deaths, Brazil number 2. We are number 3. Brazil is of an equally comparable level of economic well-being. So look at the Brazil. The Brazil economy contracted by only 9.7%. So now tell me, how can we accept the claim that India was less affected compared to other economies? The reality is, as per the IMF Global Economic Tracker, India suffered much serious, severe, grave economic erosion than most of the countries in the G20. Then I will also quote another set of data. This is data put out by the very distinguished journal, Economist. Economists studied 42 most affected nations by COVID-19. So these 42 economies, they have studied the inflation levels. Only 3 countries have experienced rise in inflation post-lockdown. In the remaining 39 countries, inflation is subdued. Only 3 nations, including India, has economic contraction and inflation. I'll tell you what is the impact of the combination of contraction and inflation. So the only Philippines is the only country where the inflation is higher than India. Why do we need to account inflation figures? So for a simple understanding, when your incomes are rising, you can afford price rise. When your incomes are stagnant or declining, the price rise will be much more debilitating. So therefore, contraction plus inflation or stagnation plus inflation is a much more lethal combination. So economists call this phenomenon as stagflation. Stagnation plus inflation is called stagflation. So India is passing through a phase of stagflation. The latest inflation numbers put the August inflation at 6.69, little better than the July inflation figures of 6.73. In June itself, India crossed the inflation figure of 6%, which is called the RBI tolerance level. Reserve Bank of India says any inflation anywhere above 6% cannot be tolerated. So we have already crossed RBI tolerance levels in terms of inflation. So why should inflation rise? Let me tell you, this inflation level of 6.69% is a retail inflation, consumer price index linked inflation, which is the inflation which common man faces. And more surprisingly, the food inflation is at a much higher level. The food inflation is at 8.2%. 3%. And the inflation in the protein-rich foods like milk, edible oils, fats, milk products is much higher. Why I'm referring to the food inflation and the inflation in the protein-rich foods is precisely because in COVID-19 we are repeatedly telling people to improve their immunity levels to protect ourselves from the infection. So food security and nutritional security are of paramount importance to ensure immunity protection from the deadly infection. So therefore, the Indian economy not only faces the problem of economic contraction, it also faces the problem of inflation. It is facing the twin problem of growth contraction and rising inflation. So my question is very simple. I've given you the Economist figures to substantiate the fact that India is only one among the three economies which are experiencing inflation post-lockdown. Why should there be an inflation? We have an agricultural growth of 3.2% in the first quarter of this financial year. Agriculture is the only sector that finds its growth in a positive territory. So therefore, there is no meaning when agriculture is witnessing a positive growth in economy, and when there is a bumper harvest. So why the monsoon is very good? Why should there be inflation? Well, supply chain bottlenecks might have contributed to the level of inflation. I do agree, but supply chain bottlenecks are also being cleared with the unlock 5.0, which we are now entering. So my point is quite simple. So why should there be inflation in Indian economy? And what the government is doing? Explore the myth. The myth is not just India, every other country is affected by the COVID-19 induced economic crisis. India is relatively far better positioned than other countries is an absolute myth, and it's a lie which is perpetrated. And the data from IMF Global Economic Tracker and data from Economists do not support this conclusion.